And our final speaker this morning was introduced this morning as well. He's the founding director of the Center of Forensic Science at the University of Technology in Sydney. And over his 19 years of experience, he has conducted research, over 70 publications, and provided expertise to the practitioner community. And his presentation will be Marketing Trace Evidence and Other Thoughts.
Thank you, Rosie. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm well conscious I'm the last man standing between you and the closing comments. So I'll try to be pretty short, but see what we can do. First thing you can probably see, I slightly changed the title. I took this liberty because basically we talked about marketing and we talked about outreach, on several occasions this week. So how do you? Which one do you? This one. So marketing trace evidence. We all agree we have a difficult job here. We have a difficult job because we have to pretty much target a lot of different audiences, and the message to come across is not necessarily easy. And I would argue it's probably not completely understood by even probably from us to some extent. So we can do some marketing, and I won't go through a list of things we can do because I think Sandy Parent and Sandy Koch first day they talked about that. We talked about that this morning. It's pretty clear that there are a lot of people we can target, but I think it's probably more important to try to think what are we going to sell. Because there is no point to discuss between ourselves and say, yes, we are fantastic, we do all this, and we all agree, and maybe we can have small differences between one person and another, between one jurisdiction and another, etc. But overall, we all agree. So maybe we should discuss what are we going to sell if we want to sell something, and I'm convinced that we have a very good story to sell. We have to try to get a consensus about our strength, our value, limitation, scope of application of trace evidence, etc. And I think ultimately we all, I hope so, we all agree that we do the middle bit pretty well. And what I call the middle bit is really the lab process, the lab analysis. It's fairly well formalized. It's very close to and I would say it's completely hard sciences. So it's easy to get SOPs, get calibration curves, get the systems working, etc. But the difficult parts are really the front end and the back end. And we had a lot of discussion before and very good talks from two previous speakers about the front end. I'll come back to that a little bit, and especially the back end. And it's where we really need to probably improve our message. When we were preparing this session, we had a few emails back and forth with the steering committee, and especially Faye and Jose, and talking about what are the challenges? What should we talk about in terms of challenges for the trace evidence community? And you've got here a list, so I won't read everything in detail. But there is a problem of caseload. Everyone is very busy, especially that a lot of the resources, as we could see with the statistics before, have been shifted towards DNA. The trace evidence business is costly. We use pretty expensive instruments, long time to do the analysis, so it costs money, etc. We talked about training, how can we cross-train people, how can we get people certified for different types of trace evidence. Again, it's a difficult challenge. Consumer ignorance or lack of knowledge about trace evidence, I think it's pretty clear. It came up several times during the week. Something that is very strongly perceived, and it's not a surprise that the theme of this symposium is interpretation. Is a bit of ignorance about the meaning of trace evidence reports from our customers. How can we educate them? How can we share this information with them? Then problems for different jurisdictions or big jurisdictions, big countries, etc. All the problem of regionalization, centralization, how we had a very good talk before about some kind of shared facilities. Then accreditation and implication of accreditations, of course, and whether forensic labs, especially trace evidence labs, can do fee-for-service analysis. Partnership, which in my views are very crucial. The challenge of training good scientists rather than good analysts, and there is a big difference here, and I'll get back to that. The different models of strategies for coordinating forensic evidence, recognition, collection, and the big problem is we are in an era of specialization. So I think Faye was very convincing, showing that there is a place for general criminalists, and it's really crucial for the field. Problem of funding, it's always there, and integration of trace evidence into investigation. I think it's something which, it's amazing, it was there, it was very strong probably 70 years ago, 50 years ago, but I think like Peter said this morning, we went a bit backwards there. And if we can provide quick information quickly at the investigative stage, I'm sure we increase the value of trace evidence. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying there aren't any other challenges or tensions because of that, but it's crucial in my views. So, I mean, that's probably a personal, from this slide, it's probably more a personal take rather than, I don't want to put the committee on the stand here. But the most crucial steps in my views really are the first, that we should really consider trace evidence as traces as the starting point. And traces really taken as a remnant of an activity. So whether it's a human activity or, I touch this piece of furniture here, so I left some traces, some marks, some finger marks. So if you detect that, it's some remnant of my activity to touch that. Now, there is a whole identification issue, but the main questions, really, it's a question of activities. How, from the traces, can we reconstruct the story? And I think it's where, as opposed to fingerprint and DNA, it's where trace evidence is highly powerful, because we are much more powerful at reconstructing the story rather than identifying individual pieces. Then the other crucial step is really to make significant effort to integrate trace evidence in investigation and intelligence. As I said before, we had a few talks during the week which were really good on that theme, and it's pretty clear. I think Skip Halleck said that don't wait for the known specimen. If we do a bit of analysis immediately without waiting for the known specimen coming, we may direct the investigation. So obviously we have more value. And maybe we don't necessarily need to apply a long and costly series of techniques all the time for every single case. It depends on the questions that we have on hand. Then the other crucial steps is really to address the could have come from syndrome. I know it's a difficult one, but I think I saw really very good talks this week about different types of surveys or showing different values in terms of how different techniques, how discriminating they are, what's common, what's less common, etc. And it's really good stuff. So we should really use it. We should really use it, even if it doesn't fit exactly with a case, because it will never fit exactly with a case. But it's already a baseline. It's already a starting point. It's better than nothing. The alternative is to say nothing or to use, I don't know what, a crystal ball or something to give the opinion. Then there is another part which is, don't want to digress too much here, but more broadly, I think there is an increasing need worldwide to evaluate the value of forensic evidence, and especially the efficiency of forensic evidence So hence trace evidence. The problem with that, quite often people come with business models, and it's a pure question of money. But it's more than that, because a lot of the things we do, it's very difficult to put a dollar value on it. It's sometimes not only crime and justice, but it's really security in a very broad sense. So it's something which is not difficult to evaluate. But I think if we go down that path, we can really bring something very good and show the real value of what we are doing. The crucial thing is really we should really recognize and be very proud that a forensic scientist is not a simple analyst. There is much more to it. We are not a process worker. We're not working in a sausage factory. So when I talked about trace evidence in investigation, and I remember last time, I might repeat that later, but 2 years ago I mentioned, we shouldn't be shy about the fact that maybe we don't have techniques that are highly discriminating, and discrimination is not everything. So this is a very important thing when we talk about trace evidence in investigations. And these are photos from the Bali bombing, the first Bali bombing in Indonesia. I don't probably know the story. A large number of Australians were killed and people from other countries. And as it happened, there was a first bomb in a pub called the Paddy's Pub. And here the purpose of the assailants was to push people out on the street. And then a secondary device exploded with much more explosives. And what happened, of course, it created a lot of damage, and a lot of people were killed that way. In Paddy's Pub, one of the theories that came up very quickly was the suicide bomber. And the suicide bomber was having explosives in a jacket, in the inside of the jacket. And these are some remains of found at Paddy's Pub. And you have bits of, this is a bit of a detonation cord. You've got a few threads here. You've got bits of metals and bits of fabric. I don't know how it is on the screen. Now, if you go totally blindly and say, okay, I optimize my SOPs in terms of lab work, so you can have all sorts of high-tech solutions. And here I've just put that as examples. But, of course, this is very lengthy. It takes a lot of time to do the analysis. It costs a lot of money. And what can you say in the context of the case? I'm not saying that it hasn't, you shouldn't do that maybe down the track, but there are other things that can be done, much more quickly. So to continue my story, these are some remains found from the body of the suicide bomber during the post-mortem. And here you can see, again, piece of fabric, some tartan material. So he wasn't Scottish, by the way. Interestingly, another thing, at a secondary crime scene, which was a place where the police presumed that there was some bomb-making facility going on. Inside a metal drum, they found this piece of tartan. Now, I think it's not really rocket science. To simple visual examination here already can identify very powerful hypotheses. I'm not saying that this is, the thing you can go to court and there wouldn't be, a clever defense lawyer coming and hammer you with that, saying, oh, you haven't done this, you haven't done that. How can you say it's exactly the same piece of clothing, etc. But at the investigative stage, the fact to, fill the dotted lines between these three pieces with a piece of fabric like that, with all these different colors and this different structure, it's highly powerful for the investigation. And I think it's a huge value for trace evidence when we start thinking that way. Another thing, we talked a lot about SOPs and normalization and standardization, and I must say sometimes I have some concerns. And especially after the NAS report for some parts of it. And again, the whole thing, we shouldn't normalize or optimize our work because it's dictated by bureaucracy. But we should do it because it's logical, scientific reasoning. And I haven't said that, so it's John Butler, who is a highly respected person, scientist in his field. And I think it's a good summary of the situation. So if we do stuff, if we follow some rules, it's not because we have to, hopefully, but it's because it makes good scientific reasoning. So something we shouldn't forget. Now, if we move a bit further about one of the other crucial themes, which was opinion. I'm sure my colleagues from Adelaide, Des and Haley here would probably know this case. It's been done to death, probably. It's one of the two major royal commissions that happened in Australia over the years. So the other one is the Lindy Chamberlain case that probably you know about the dingo took my baby. So this is not this one. This is another one. Where you can read there was a murder of an elderly who had been badly beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled in her bedroom. And a lot of trace evidence, very complex mixture of trace evidence was found at the scene and was used, to make a link to the defendant here. But what's interesting is what's written in the Royal Commission report, and especially this part saying, basically, it's a vital obligation of the scientists to explain the weight and substance and significance of the evidence. So I know you are not in an Australian jurisdiction, but I think it's interesting to see that we tend sometimes to be driven by lawyers, but in that sort of case, I mean, they even tell us, yes, we need to give a good opinion. We need to give the opinion about the weight of the evidence. What are we showing here? And this is the end. And you've got some photos of them. I think there were 17 different types of trace evidence materials. So it was a very, very complex case from the trace evidence perspective. Now, another thing, when we think about interpretation and think about identification, how can we identify stuff and different types of evidence? I must admit, I did a BSc, a PhD in forensic science, and it's only years after that one of my old colleagues in Lausanne, mentioned that there was this work that was from the University of California, and it was totally forgotten. It was a PhD thesis talking about inference of identity of source, and it's good reading, and I've summarized a few points here, but basically what it says, it's the work we do, especially when we try to identify items, it's a whole hypothetical deductive process, and it's exactly what we do in forensic science in general. We identify hypotheses, which are the best hypotheses at the time with the information we have in hand, and then we make deductions and try to reconstruct. And then if the hypothesis can change, they can be reviewed depending on the new information that comes through. The other points are extremely important too, that we shouldn't be only interested in the application of the techniques, but we should really be interested in the underlying rules, how these items can be transferred, why, what are the underlying rules here. And obviously, if we use techniques, they must be appropriate to the context of a given problem of identity of source. So if we use such and such technique, we must make sure that it makes sense in the context of the questions that are being asked. So when you talk about expression of opinion, Graham Jackson, who used to work at the FSS in the UK, made a few presentations recently and wrote a chapter in this new book called Handbook of Forensic Science from Jim Fraser and Robin Williams in the UK. And he's got a whole chapter about expression of opinion. And he listed here a whole series of opinion, and by no means, this is exhaustive. But he mentioned a list of different types of opinions he saw over the years in his work from colleagues, from other people, other countries, etc. And it's extremely interesting reading. I'm sure, many of you maybe use some of these sentences, or, can like some of them, dislike some of them. So in the book, these phrases are pretty much discussed, pros and cons and strengths, limitations, etc. Basically, the ones that are more recommended, so to speak, would be sentences like this one, for example. Although that the problem with that is it gives only one side of the story. So if you really want to be, accurate, you should add what happens with the other side of the story. But again, at the end of the day, it's your phrasing. If you are in the witness stand, you must be comfortable with what was written in the report. So I'm not telling you that you should write this or that, but I'm just telling you, these are phrases that have been discussed, they've been around, they all have limitations and strength. So there is a lot of food for thought here. Another thing when we talk about identification and the questions we try to answer, this is a crucial paper in my view, talking about hierarchy of propositions, to try to identify the level really of the questions we try to address, because they can be very different, and depending on what the question is, the test we use can be very different. So in this paper, for example, and these people have done a lot of other work later on of all different aspects, but this is the fundamental paper, which really identify these three levels, source, activity, and offense. And just to give you an example, if we take glass, if at the source level, the answer could be the glass fragment came from window X. At the activity level, is Mr. A is the man who smashed window X. At the offense level, is Mr. A committed the burglary. So we would agree that they all mean different things. So the questions each time can be very different. And what happens in terms of the work we are doing, the higher we can move here, the more valuable we are to the criminal justice system. However, the trick is the higher we move here, the more difficult it is to do it or do it properly. So basically, we have to be careful not to go too far. But in some cases, we are able really to say something about the activity. In many cases, we are limited by saying something about the source. Just to give you, push further the example, and I don't want to repeat the whole presentation that Susan Bennett did 2 years ago, which was this murder case in New South Wales. But I just want to take that as an example to highlight a couple of points. So a victim was found, a young girl was found dead at the side of the road. The main forensic evidence, or the only forensic evidence, was a combination of 3 types of fibers. So you've got the actual shoes from the case. These fibers were found on the shoes, and they were made of polypropylene, gray polypropylene, blue polypropylene, and black polyester. And these fibers could be, after a lot of work, they were compared to fibers from the car carpet owned by the ex-boyfriend. And bingo, they couldn't be discriminated. There was other things in the story, and the ex-boyfriend was charged. Now, the typical question, and questions we always struggle with, and we may even be scared sometimes, is the question: fibers are not unique, are they? what can you say? Fibers it's not DNA, it's not fingerprint. So it's very, very limited. What can you say here? And then, you can start to waffle a bit and try to say, oh yeah, I cannot say it's this car carpet and not any other car carpet in the world, but it's worth something. I'm not too sure, but here my point is the police and the lab tried to do a bit of background survey in relation to this case. And they didn't come up with a result saying, okay, we've got these statistics, I can have hard statistics telling you this. But the combination of the information they gave here at the trial basically stopped the argument for the defense. They didn't come up with the source argument, with the identification argument, because they thought that in this case, what was actually crucial, it's not the source level, but it's the activity level. Because she was the ex-girlfriend, it made sense that she could have been in this car. So they started to say, okay, yes, she was in this car, but a long time ago, because unfortunately for the defendant, he had already said that she hadn't been in the car, recently. So he said something like a couple of months or something like that. So the whole thing turned around and talking about the activity level. So I find this is very interesting because it's exactly where trace evidence is strong. It's this activity level, where, when, etc. And the court outcome, so he got 20 years for murder, and there was an appeal on some legal ground, and I think it was not that I think, but I'm sure he's been charged and he's been found guilty a second time around, and he had more the second time than the first time. Interpretation issues. So these are some except from the NAS report. Talking about that we have some gaps in our knowledge in interpretation. We have some lack of statistical foundation. We need a statistical framework, etc. A lot of people, I know a lot of people can be against or for a Bayesian approach. There are a lot of debate, a lot of discussions. But my point here, a lot of people have worked on it. It's there. If you are interested in it, it's worth considering it, and I would really recommend it. But it's probably more important in this stage really to put an opinion where you are really comfortable with, but these things exist. One thing I wanted to talk about the NAS report, and it's been a bit implicit in the discussion this morning, but I don't think it's been really made explicit. And to me, it's probably the most crucial paragraph in the NAS report is when they say this, talking about the knowledge base, and basically saying that knowledge is the single most critical resource for forensic science. We can put more, add more dollars and more people. It will reduce the backlog, but it doesn't mean we'll do the job better, smarter, and we'll increase our knowledge. So this is very, very important and very interesting. And to go further, here it's really to talk about knowledge and not only processes. So it's where I start to be a bit worried when we try to over-formalize and go towards a way which is highly normative and think that we are going to solve all the problems by going that way. Because it's not, and I think Marianne did a very good job this morning summarizing this issue. Now, I'm an academic, Marianne, so it's probably why I don't like too many rules. Now, more seriously, I think it's the knowledge is really the crucial thing, and all the transfer of existing knowledge and creation of new knowledge, they are really crucial. And here there is the interaction between academia and operations. It's very important, and it's not only academic. I put two small examples here from Switzerland where people try to do a bit of studies about the value and the quantity of evidence and forensic information brought back from the crime scene according to various factors. And we all know that from crime scene units to crime scene units, the quality can change. The amount of exhibits brought back can change. And even within one crime scene unit, from one individual to another one, the results can be very different. These studies, what they found obviously that factors such as motivation, they are very important. And even, funnily enough, for example, for footwear impression, it was found that smaller people brought back more footwear impression than taller people. And it's a bit logical. If you are tall, you have to bend more, and then after a while, maybe you are a bit more lazy. But one thing they showed as well is when the crime scene staff has a better knowledge, better expertise, and a real scientific expertise, they bring back more useful exhibits, both in a quantitative and qualitative terms. So that's very interesting. So the other thing, we talked about research slightly, a bit this morning. So there was this quote from the NAS report. I'm just wondering whether there is an identification bias here, because it looks like forensic science is quite often taken as an identification science and nothing else. But bottom line, yes, there is a need for more research. That's pretty clear. Again, I was very pleased to see some of the work that has been presented this week, especially yesterday and today, about all these surveys. And just to go quickly through some of the work we've been doing. I'm probably very biased here. I'm not saying it's complete, and it's a review of what's out there. It's really what we've been doing in my university, just to show you that it's not that difficult to get some of these little surveys, especially if you have access to interns and collaborations with universities. So, Susan Bennett was here this week. She did her PhD in the field, so she got a lot of different types of data about fiber classes worn by the population. Another study about fiber population after washing. We always show pretty much, get an idea of the polymorphism between the different types of generic class and color, and we show that very quickly. We get some respectable frequencies we can work with. I don't know why the photo is not here, but the same thing, glass on shoes. So we had a student going to bowling alleys and taking shoes and scraping the sole to try to see how many glass fragments would be found there. And even DNA, it was a fair comment before, talking about maybe trace will be only DNA then. But in the same time, what you call contact DNA, and we tend to call it trace DNA. In the end, it's the same, it's part of trace evidence. Okay, it's biological, it's DNA, but it's like hair. It's the whole science of how it can be transferred, how it can persist, how it can be detected, how relevant it is, how we can take it from the background, etc. It's pretty much a typical trace evidence. A few things I wanted to highlight after some discussions I've heard during the week. Talking about error rate. So my main point, what I can struggle sometimes, is what's an error? So before we talk about error rate, we should really try to identify an error, and it can be very different depending on the people and depending on the type of evidence. And one thing which is, should be clear is that an error is not the lack of ability to discriminate. Saying that a technique, say, okay, what's the value of blue cotton? And say that, you may have blue cotton from different garments and you can't discriminate them. So what's the error rate there? It's not, to me, it's not an error. It's simply the inability or lack of ability of such and such technique to discriminate between very similar samples. The error would be if the forensic scientist identifies cotton as polyester. And then, you can double check that, and then the other one says, no, it's polyester. So to me, that's an error. Now, I know people in fingerprints, they struggled a bit with a lot of these things, and they came up with pretty good solutions, and things like an error rate of a methodology is extremely difficult to assess, as opposed to the error rate of an individual. And things that we can rely on is through past experience, statistical studies, and proficiency testing. And the other thing is the absence of statistics or error rates does not necessarily mean that the evidence is unreliable. It's two different things. Now, having said that, I appreciate that you are, many of you in Dorbert jurisdiction. It can be interpreted differently. Now, going to the wider forensic science area, I think the real crucial question, and it's really what's the impact of forensic science? Not only trace evidence, I mean, the corollary will be, of course, trace evidence as well, but what's the real impact of forensic science? And we've been increasingly asked to demonstrate that. And as I said before, because mainly a dollar question, but it's more than that. What's the real efficiency of forensic science, especially in relation of the wider security? And interestingly, more and more studies are done by people outside the forensic science arena, criminologists, various social scientists, economists, etc. But as forensic scientists, most forensic scientists are not interested in that, or they find that too difficult. And in a way, it's a shame. It's a difficult topic, but in a way, it's a shame because really, we are the best people to try to at least give part of the answer. If we leave the sociologists and economists to come up with the answers, it's like if we leave the whole thing to the lawyers. Sorry if there are any lawyers in the room. So very few studies have actually done that. In Australia, there is one. It wasn't the DNA area, but if you read his thesis, it's much more than that. You've got plenty of information. It's the recent PhD thesis from Simon Walsh, evaluating the role of impact of forensic DNA profiling in key areas of the criminal justice system. And it's difficult, but it has to be done. There is another project that has just started. It's a big collaborative work with different people, criminologists, sociologists, forensic scientists, operational laboratories, etc. That you've got a little blurb here, but trying to evaluate this effectiveness of forensic science. And you've got all the work from Olivier Ribot in Switzerland. I think his views are very, very interesting. Trying to take forensic science in really the wider arena of security, and not only police and criminal justice, but really talk about intelligence and security as a paradigm. So it's very interesting. So what's the future? I think we had a few interesting talks before. And I think the economic realities are here, so we have maybe to change a few things in the way we deal with our disciplines and reassess the place and the shape of trace evidence. But I think it's clear, especially after Faye's talk, in ultra-specialization, we should be very careful with that. There is a place for a generalist. It's crucial. And if we want to use emerging technologies, they will probably save a lot of things. We'll have a lot of new technologies that can help as tools, like, for example, the presentation I made this morning with this new digital photomontaging for hair, but it's not for the sake of it. It has to be fit for purpose. It has to help with a problem. And with new technologies, I think we'll have a blur between the boundaries between lab and field forensic science. And I think Peter De Forest this morning made a good point that, people going to the scene, they should be scientists. And whether you work in the lab or with the scene, it's a scientific process you use. It will streamline the analytical process, leading to quicker results. And hopefully, with some of the freed up time, scientists will have a bit more time to spend on difficult cases, or to get this sort of background data needed to help with such and such case for the interpretation. Try to give more meaningful results. And again, try to remember that discrimination is not the most significant feature for trace evidence. I mean, I'm not saying it's not important, but the value added of trace evidence, it's really that it can answer the what happened question, really the activity or the story, whatever name you want to give, but it helps to tell the story. which more identifying types of evidence have more difficult to deal with, because DNA is good to identify someone, the same for a fingerprint, but then really to give a story, it's more difficult. So short conclusion, so we really face the challenge. We need to face the challenges, but there are opportunities as well. I mean, it's pretty clear that, with the whole environment, with the NAS report, I mean, there are opportunities here that should be seized. And I think in a way, it's difficult times, but I think it's, very exciting times as well. So there are really two sides. And if we are very strategic about it, I think trace evidence will be saved, because there are a lot of things that can be done with trace evidence, and we will agree. So a few acknowledgements here, the different people who have contributed to different parts of the work or have inspired me greatly during my career. And again, maybe you are sick of that now. Should put that as a subliminal photo. But if you are free in September next year, you don't know what to do, you have enough funding, we would love to see you there. So thanks for listening.
Questions or comments for Claude? I was going to offer for the whole panel, but we've lost two to take flights to the West Coast. Pete?
Yeah, I just have a comment, and it would apply for the whole panel, and those who know me won't find this to be a surprise, but I think that this session, and thank you, Jose, has been the single most valuable one of the whole symposium. It's been a very, very good symposium, but I'm sorry to see the ranks thinned a little bit here, but I think this is the single most valuable thing. I'd like to see us take this kind of case examples and model and philosophy and get it out there among the user agencies, so that we can really see how important trace evidence, or demonstrate how important it is, and not see the thing wither on the vine. Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you for the comments. Anybody else? I want to thank the panel for their presentations. Thank you.